Now, the amazing thing about the United States, and this is sort of a historical trajectory, right? When Christopher Columbus arrived in America, he thought he was in India, right? Hence Indians, right? American Indians. There's a state called Indiana. He thought he was in India. And he was looking for India, right? So even on his deathbed, he insisted that he had found India, right? Because if he didn't find India, right, then his whole life was a failure. And for the next 100 years, every European explorer, basically, I don't know if anything has happened like this before. Like, you found this huge territory of land, and you were just desperate to get past it, right? Like, that's great. Like, let's keep going, right? Like, good for you. You found an island. That's really nice. Let's keep going. Some of the statistics are hilarious. So the British named part of it New England. I grew up in New England. And for the first 100 years, every time they sent a ship of Europeans there, they would die because they thought that because the name was New England, it was the same climate as England, right? So when the summer came, they would boil to death, right? And when the winter came, they would freeze to death. And nobody seemed to learn anything for 100 years. So they just sent people there and said, no, the weather's not that bad. It just rains a little bit. It's England, right? And then they would go there and they'd freeze to death. Bitch at it. So life sucks sometimes. Now, since then, Americans have never known where they are, right? This is a commonplace. There's a joke in the United States that 50% of Americans cannot find America on a map of America, right? Like, they have no idea where they are in the world. And this is an unfortunate reality in the United States, partially because the country is so big, partially because everything's so far away. If you live, for example, in Pakistan, there's lots of countries and cultures around you. If you live in the middle of the United States, you can drive for 1,000 kilometers, and all you will see are McDonald's. Like, you will not, and it's really depressing. It's the worst thing in the world, right? If there's no crisis, you will kill yourself. The point is that you don't see difference. Do you understand what I'm saying? So your assumption is that the world is like this place, and you have very little awareness of the rest of the world. So for many Americans, they had no idea of American foreign policy, and then 9/11 happened. Right? So they had no idea of the Iraq War, of sanctions, of Israel, Palestine. Like, these things were not in their mental universe. Does that make sense? They didn't see them. So they were desperate for someone to explain what had just happened. Things turned the way they did is because a group of people had a story ready. That Muslims hate the West, and they hate you, meaning Americans, and they want to kill you. And nothing you do or say will change that. They're not rational like you and me, right? They're just like animals, or barbarians, or simply at an earlier stage of civilization. And so therefore, you are defending yourself from a threat from a people who want to conquer you. It's no different than the Nazis, or the Soviet Union, or what have you. And if you have no prior experience of anyone, who's going to change the narrative? Right? You don't if you've never met someone who's Muslim, what are you going to believe? Right? If I give you a book on the history of Peru right now, can you tell me if it's accurate or not? Probably not. Not because you're not unintelligent people, it's because maybe you don't know anything about South America. And suddenly someone's asking you right now, what should Pakistan's relationship to South America be? And if you screw this up, there's going to be a war. Right? That's a lot of pressure. So there was no counter-narrative. So basically, does this make sense? This is a story, right? This is the story people told. All these things happened because of this, and this is what you're supposed to do with it. The story began breaking down when the Iraq War went south, right? Which anyone could have told you would happen, right? When the Arab Spring happened, right? And when Donald Trump showed up. Because all three things completely exploded the narrative. Afghanistan and Iraq are the longest wars in American history. Second, the Arab Spring happened. So if the assumption is that all Muslims or all Arabs are kind of crazy, then a bunch of kids come out in the street using social media. So first it's like, oh, they have technology, right? And then two, they're calling for democracy. And three, they're peaceful. So you lied to me, right? And then Donald Trump happened. The interesting thing about Donald Trump is that he did a few things to American society. He revealed how much anger there is in American society. And the anger is where I want to go with this speech. Because the anger, fundamentally, that feeling, is about the value of citizen journalism and the value of storytelling and the danger of not telling stories. When the Arab Spring happened, right, a lot of the people who were basically the professional, I call them Islam-splainers, right, whose job it was in American culture to explain the Muslim world, realized that they were wrong, right? And so they immediately lost authority because suddenly the news anchor will say, you know, well, you told us X, Y, and Z, and now I'm watching TV and none of these things appear to be true. But the second thing that happened is that people of color, for lack of a better term, the global south, the east, whatever you want to call it, had their ability to tell their own stories. So in and of itself, if CNN's like main Islam person suddenly is proven to be wrong, that's not fatal, right? It's a problem, but it's not fatal. But if a kid can record a video and upload it to YouTube or Facebook or send it to Al Jazeera, now you don't just look wrong, you're losing audience. Because someone's going to go somewhere else to hear the story. Because clearly you can't tell the story. And that was the first time when mainstream American media had to pay attention to other voices. The problem is that many people who could tell those stories did not invest in those stories. So in American Pakistani communities, there's like a hierarchy of jobs, right? That determine whether or not you're going to get married, basically, right? Like we are basically, like we have a eugenics program, right? Like unless you meet certain conditions, we're not allowing you to have children, right? Like you can't have a family. So pehle to doctor banna hai, right? Like if you're not a doctor, basically you failed, right? So you have to be a doctor. Next is engineer. And third is some kind of import-export business. Nobody knows, I have no idea what they're doing, right? Nobody knows, just import-export. I don't know, maybe they're selling sonf, I have no idea. Maybe they're selling mangoes, I don't know. That's fine. But this is the hierarchy, right? So like doctor, engineer, import-export. Anything after that, you're somewhere over there. Like nobody wants to talk to you, right? Like no rishta is coming for you. Nobody will marry you. Until you're 75, no one will help you, right? You're gonna die alone. But it's okay, everybody's gonna die. It's just worse for you because you'll die alone, right? Also, my 7-year-old nephew, Zahid, he wants to be a farmer. So I have no idea where that goes on the list. The reason I say that is because there were very few people who were capable of explaining what was happening. So the reason I'm on CNN is not because I do anything good, is because there was no one else, right? Like everyone else was a doctor. So they weren't gonna go on TV, they were busy making money. I get to go on TV and I have no money. So it's a good balance. So you should become doctors. I'm just kidding. Don't become a doctor. Good. So the point being that the twofold, right? One is at some point the narrative is going to break down. At some point the story people tell themselves, right? If it's not an inclusive story, it's going to fail. Does that make sense? If you tell yourself, right? Like if you tell yourself that the occupation of Palestine is sustainable, you can tell yourself that for maybe 50 years. But at some point, it's going to fail. But the second issue is that when it does, who's there to explain why it failed? And if people aren't invested in telling their own stories and building their own platforms, then when people come looking for an explanation, they won't find your explanation. They may find no explanation. Or someone may come up with another explanation that's also inaccurate. So the Arab Spring had this effect in American media of changing things. Social media in general in the United States has had a very powerful effect, negative and positive. It's negative because it allows you to live in a bubble. Until about 10 years ago, if you became a journalist, you had to do it in certain professions, certain companies, certain institutions, right? There was like CNN and Fox News and like 10 or 12 major newspapers. And that was it. Now, the problem is that these were controlled by small groups of people who were overwhelmingly white men, right? So if you were not a white man, you were not going to enter into this profession very easily. But the upside is that when you have a fewer amount of resources, everyone has to read the same thing. So we're all reading the same thing. With social media, the upside is that everyone now, for the first time, right, has the ability to tell their own story. But that also means that you can all be listening to 1,000 different stories, which means you can inhabit 1,000 different universes. And you can be sitting next to each other and talk to each other every day, but when you read the news, you have your own news feed, which means that you have a completely different explanation of how the world works. Your job as storytellers is to find a way to explain things in a way that resonates with people. Now, you know your context better than I do. But I'll give you an example of why many American Muslim communities in the United States have failed. Right? The American Muslim narrative goes something like this. Sometimes when we get on the plane, somebody says, you're wearing hijab, you shouldn't be on the plane, I'm scared. I'm being discriminated against. You've probably seen this, people get kicked off of planes and things like that, right? The average American says, so? The average American says, somebody wants to blow up the plane. So if once in a while you get kicked off the plane, I'm okay with that. Because I don't want to die. Right? Inconvenience, my narrative is you have inconvenienced me. And your narrative is you want to kill me. Right? Like, they're not the same. Because if someone's narrative is existential, like my life is in danger, then I don't really care if you missed your flight. Too bad. Get another flight, right? Like, it's not the end of the world. Do you see what I'm saying? So to the average American, it sounds like most Muslims are whining. They're like, well, what do you want us to do? Pretend there's not a problem? So it doesn't come out equally, right? Like, it's not balanced. Right? I can't go on vacation to Disney World versus I'm still alive. Right? Like, doesn't commute. Right? It doesn't fit in people's minds. So the narrative doesn't make sense. That doesn't mean that what's happening is fair. I'm not agreeing with it. I'm telling you how people see the event. Right? So until and unless the narrative makes sense, right? Like, to me, not to you, to me, then I don't care what your narrative is. If you can't explain why this matters to me, then I don't really care what happens to you because my life is in danger.